Chapter 1. The Realm of the Hungry Ghost Picture. A wheel, ancient and unyielding, turning through the various domains of human existence. In Buddhist psychology, this is the mandala of the Wheel of Life. Among its domains lies the realm of the hungry ghosts, populated by creatures with scrawny, emaciated necks, tiny mouths, and distended, empty bellies. They are driven by an insatiable, agonizing yearning to be filled, to find relief from an aching void, yet they can never consume enough to satisfy their bloated stomachs. This haunting image captures the profound reality of addiction. It is a state of perpetual seeking, an endless haunting of one's own life without ever being truly present. The substances or behaviors pursued are desperate attempts to soothe an internal devastation, to escape a deeper, more terrifying domain. The hell realm of unbearable emotional pain, rage, and despair. Addiction is not a moral failing or a simple lack of willpower. It is a complex, heartbreaking response to human suffering. To understand it, one must look beyond the surface behaviors and stare into the deep, dark mirror of society's shadow side, recognizing that the haunting gaze of the hungry ghost reflects a vulnerability that exists within us all. Vancouver's downtown east side stands as a stark epicenter of this hungry ghost realm. On the sidewalks, amidst the roar of traffic, a chaotic and tragic ballet unfolds daily. A frail woman might perform a frantic, stimulant-driven pirouette, while another individual, confined to a motorized wheelchair, delivers brilliant but disjointed monologues about history and philosophy. Nearby, someone else displays arms marked by the parallel scars of self-inflicted razor wounds, each line a desperate attempt to obliterate a deeper psychological agony with physical pain. This is the domain where survival and suffering intertwine. Medical care in such an environment takes on a unique, almost palliative quality. The goal is rarely to cure, but to alleviate the crushing impact of severe dependency, infectious diseases, and relentless social ostracization. The facilities that house these marginalized individuals operate on a radical principle of unconditional acceptance, offering a space where the traumatized can exist without the constant barrage of judgment and harassment. Death is a frequent visitor in these corridors. Funerals are regular occurrences, gathering mourners who themselves bear the ravages of severe illness and relentless substance use. The baffling grip of this dependency becomes apparent when witnessing individuals who continue to inject narcotics despite facing amputations, rampant infections, or the immediate threat of a fatal overdose. Negative consequences, which might deter a healthy mind, hold no sway here. The drug is not merely a bad habit, it is a perceived necessity for survival. It provides a fleeting escape from an agonizing reality, offering a momentary emotional anesthetic against the crushing weight of depression, anxiety, and deeply ingrained trauma. Without it, the individual is left unprotected against the onslaught of their own mind. The origins of this relentless pursuit invariably trace back to profound childhood pain. A vast majority of those trapped in the extremes of addiction have endured unimaginable abuse, neglect, and exploitation during their most vulnerable years. For them, the drug acts as a barrier against the overwhelming terror of their memories. It suppresses the vulnerability that was exploited long ago. When the capacity to feel is shut down to survive catastrophic early trauma, the world becomes a dull, empty void. The substance momentarily reawakens a sense of vitality, offering a chemical surge of energy, a synthetic burst of sociability, and a fleeting illusion of completeness. It masks the deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and the terror of isolation. The pursuit of the high is less about chasing euphoria and more about achieving a temporary state of invulnerability. The stories carried by these individuals are devastating in their sorrow, defying the limits of empathetic imagination. One might hear of a young woman subjected to relentless sexual violation by her own family members, entrusted to a caregiver who was entirely paralyzed by their own afflictions. Fleeing to the streets to find her estranged mother, she is instead introduced to intravenous narcotics by the very woman who gave her life, only to be sold into exploitation while she slept. For such a soul, the drug becomes the only reliable shelter, the only sanctuary from a mind haunted by unimaginable betrayal. The profound grief of abandoning one's own children often compounds this pain, creating a cycle of guilt that demands even heavier sedation. Working amidst this profound suffering strips away the protective veneers of professional detachment. The caregiver is forced to look into the dark mirror of the streets and recognize their own reflections. The same dynamics that drive the street dweller to a syringe operate in the socially acceptable addictions of the successful professional. Whether it is a relentless compulsion to work, an obsession with acquiring material goods, or an endless craving for status, the underlying mechanism is identical: a flight from emotional discomfort and an attempt to fill an inner void with an external distraction. The socially sanctioned addict is simply fortunate enough that their compulsions are rewarded by society rather than criminalized. Acknowledging this shared human frailty dissolves the artificial boundary between the healer and the afflicted, replacing judgment with a humbling, compassionate curiosity. Confronted with such staggering generational trauma, the easy moral judgments of society crumble. The line separating the functional citizen from the destitute addict is astonishingly thin, often drawn by the sheer luck of a protected childhood rather than superior moral fiber. Recognizing the profound humanity within this suffering requires a suspension of prejudice and a willingness to see that the frantic pursuit of an external fix is, at its core, a tragically misguided quest for the peace, love, and wholeness that every human being inherently deserves. To observe the profound physical toll of these substances is to witness a slow, agonizing surrender of the body. Cocaine, heroin, crystal meth, and alcohol become the solitary pillars supporting fragile, shattered psyches. For many, heroin provides the elusive feeling of being enveloped in a warm, protective embrace, a maternal comfort that was completely absent from their formative years. It is an artificial love, a chemical surrogate for the secure attachments they were denied. When the drug floods the brain, the agonizing echoes of past abuse and present destitution are silenced. Cocaine, conversely, offers a temporary surge of power and invulnerability. It provides an intoxicating illusion of absolute control for individuals who have spent their entire lives being victimized, overpowered, and discarded by others. They are not merely seeking a recreational high. They are desperately seeking an antidote to an existence characterized by chronic terror and utter helplessness. The substances serve as the keys to a fleeting paradise, a temporary sanctuary from a hellish internal landscape. The life stories that echo through the examination rooms of the downtown East Side are almost invariably chronicles of unimaginable betrayal. To hear them is to confront the darkest, most unfathomable capacities of human behavior. There are narratives of children locked in closets for days, subjected to sadistic punishments, or traded for narcotics by their own parents. When the foundation of a human life is built upon such catastrophic violations of fundamental trust, the resulting emotional architecture is profoundly unstable. The psyche shatters as a necessary defense mechanism, compartmentalizing the unbearable memories just to survive the day. Yet the pain constantly leaks through, a relentless, low-grade agony that demands suppression. The ultimate tragedy is that the chosen method of suppression, the substance, eventually becomes an even more ruthless abuser, exacting a toll far greater than the temporary relief it provides. It is a profound paradox that the very tools used to escape pain become the architects of new, devastating suffering. The relentless pursuit of the substance completely overrides fundamental survival instincts. Basic hunger is ignored, safe shelter is forsaken, personal dignity is sacrificed without hesitation. The biological imperative to protect oneself is hijacked by the brain's desperate, chemically induced conviction that the drug is the sole requirement for life. This is the lethal hold of the addiction. It is a biological deception of the highest order, where the mind becomes utterly convinced that the poison is the only cure. As a physician witnessing this daily tragedy, the initial impulse is often to save, to fix, to cure. However, the reality of severe addiction demands a radical redefinition of medical success. Healing cannot be measured solely by abstinence, nor can relapse be viewed as a moral failure. When the root cause is a gaping, unhealed wound in the soul, simply removing the anesthetic without treating the wound is not a solution. It is an act of cruelty. True care in this environment involves offering a steady, fiercely non-judgmental presence. It means sitting with the pain, acknowledging the profound suffering without turning away, and recognizing the individual's inherent worth despite the devastation wrought by their coping mechanisms. It is a commitment to seeing the human being obscured by the hungry ghost, validating their struggle, and providing a space where, perhaps for the first time in their lives, they are neither exploited nor condemned. This requires a profound shift in perspective, a move away from the punitive models that criminalize pain and toward a framework of compassionate curiosity. It asks us to look past the agonizing behaviors, the deceit, the manipulation, the self-destruction, and ask not why the addiction, but why the pain. Only by understanding the excruciating nature of the underlying wounds can we begin to comprehend the desperate lengths to which individuals will go to find relief. The hungry ghost is not a monster to be vanquished or a criminal to be punished. It is a fractured soul desperately crying out for a nourishment it has never known, trapped in a cycle of suffering that demands our deepest empathy rather than our judgment. Chapter 2. The Echoes of the Past. To walk through the downtown East Side is to walk through a living museum of shattered histories. The individuals who inhabit these streets are not merely running from the present, they are relentlessly pursued by the echoes of their pasts. These echoes reverberate through their veins and their minds, shaping every frantic pursuit of the next high. Some carry the weight of ancient ancestral spirits, while others are haunted by the specific, agonizing memories of childhood betrayal. To understand the depth of their addiction, one must listen to these echoes, tracing the intricate threads of lost innocence, squandered potential, and the desperate, enduring search for a glimmer of grace amidst overwhelming darkness. Angela McDowell carries the bearing of a Coast Salish princess, even as she lives the life of an exile, her face marked by a horizontal scar earned in a sordid hotel dispute. A poet who writes of hope and desolation in a pink wire-bound notebook, her smile reveals a profound joy that predates her life as a cocaine-wired hustler. Raised by her grandfather, a great shaman of her tribe, she was subjected to the grueling sacred ritual of the spirit bath at the age of 7. Stripped naked in the freezing river at dawn, brushed with cedar boughs, she was tested to see if she could carry the spiritual gift of her ancestors. While the ice-cold water threatened to break her, Angela heard the sound of native drums and beautiful, ancient singing. She was transported, finding herself singing along in a language she had not yet learned. In a clearing by the river, she and her grandfather listened to the voices of the dead, receiving the teachings of generations. Although that profound connection has been obscured by subsequent childhood abuse and her current descent into addiction, the quiet confidence of the ancient ones still speaks through her, a spiritual truth that survives even the most harrowing existence. For others, the past does not sing, it screams. Celia's room, bathed in midday sunlight, is a chaotic wasteland of shattered television screens, broken glass, and blood-caked syringes. Raging barefoot amidst the destruction, her voice grating and unearthly, she curses her partner, Rick. Yet, beneath this explosive, cocaine-fueled madness lies a terrified 30-year-old woman desperately trying to escape the nightmares of her childhood. Sexually exploited by her stepfather from the age of 5, she is tortured by dreams where she is drenched in his saliva, a grotesque ritual she was forced to endure. The drugs offer a momentary coma, a sanctuary where she feels nothing. When Celia becomes pregnant, a fierce, protective instinct awakens within her. She vows to keep her child, to defy the cycle of abandonment that has defined her life. She and Rick, a veteran haunted by his own post-traumatic stress from Sarajevo, share tender hopes for their baby's future. Yet, the grip of cocaine proves too ruthless. Despite her artistic soul, her beautiful singing voice, and her desperate prayers to the Great Spirit, the addiction overrides her maternal resolve. The child is born healthy, but is soon surrendered to foster care as Celia, consumed by the agonizing pain of a past she cannot outrun, flees back to the needle, her dream of a family shattered by a compulsion she cannot control. The trauma of the past can also twist the intellect into a weapon of self-destruction. Ralph, a brilliant but deeply sad man who leans on a cane and sports a makeshift mohawk, masks his agonizing loneliness behind a barrage of historical delusions and hateful rhetoric. He wields Nazi slogans not out of genuine ideological belief, but as a desperate mechanism to push the world away before it can hurt him again. beneath this abrasive exterior lies a deeply cultured soul who can effortlessly discuss Dostoevsky and recite the poetry of Nietzsche and Goethe from memory. He speaks wistfully of a youthful adventure in Bonn, breaking into Beethoven's birthroom with a girl, wine, and marijuana, playing the master's piano in a fleeting moment of joyous rebellion. Today, he survives by inhaling cooked xylocaine to freeze the capillaries in his brain, seeking just 5 minutes of respite from his physical pain and the haunting hatred of an abusive father. For those 5 minutes of peace, he hustles endlessly up and down the avenues, a man who yearns to fly, but is hopelessly tethered to the ground by his own unresolved agony. He seeks the divine, consoling love described in the final lines of Faust, but finds only the cold, mechanical rush of stimulants. Yet even in this bleak landscape, where the past continually assaults the present, profound moments of reprieve and humanity emerge. The misery is extraordinary, but so is the grace. Josh, a powerfully built young man prone to violent, drug-fueled paranoia, possesses the astonishing emotional clarity to apologize to his doctor, recognizing the heavy burden the clinic staff carries. Remy, a man whose mind races uncontrollably due to severe hyperactivity, finds a moment of profound peace when a medication allows him to slow down enough to confront a terrible crime he committed 11 years prior. He writes a letter of agonizing remorse to the family of the man he killed, an act of pure contrition that, even unsent, begins to heal his fractured spirit. Dean, a former highly successful executive who lost everything to a voracious heroin and cocaine habit, transforms his harrowing experiences into a crusade for his fellow addicts, helping to establish life-saving harm reduction facilities. Having purged the horrors of his prison years by speaking them aloud, he actively seeks to bring light back into a community defined by its darkness. And there are countless quiet acts of redemption. Women like Judy, who, having barely survived a crippling spinal infection, now walks the streets at night handing out condoms and offering a protective, watchful eye over the sex trade workers still caught in the cycle. Amidst the theft, the disease, and the relentless hustling, these individuals forge a vital network of mutual care. They look out for one another in the dingy hotel corridors, proving that even when the brain is hijacked by addiction and the soul is battered by history, the fundamental human drive for connection, dignity, and light cannot be entirely extinguished. Chapter 3. Physician, heal thyself. The demarcation between the healer and the afflicted is a comforting illusion. It is deeply reassuring to observe the devastated lives on the streets and construct a formidable wall of separation, a psychological boundary built upon the assumption of a fundamental difference in character or constitution. Yet when the clinical gaze is ruthlessly turned inward, these defensive walls crumble. The stark, unsettling realization emerges that the mechanisms driving the destitute street user are not alien to the successful professional. They are simply manifested in socially acceptable, even rewarded behaviors. Addiction is not a binary state, an affliction that happens only to them. It is a broad human continuum, and many who wear the crisp white coat reside firmly upon it. Consider the true nature of obsession. For years, a relentless, consuming compulsion dictated the rhythms of a supposedly orderly and respectable life, the insatiable manic acquisition of classical music recordings. This was not a mere hobby, nor was it a profound appreciation for art. It was a behavioral addiction in its purest form. The craving would strike with an intense physical urgency, overriding all logic, professional responsibility, and personal commitments. A simple, intended trip to the store would inevitably result in thousands of dollars spent in a frenzied, trance-like blur, acquiring symphonies, operas, and concertos that would often sit entirely unlistened to, still tightly sealed in their plastic wrappers. The music itself was secondary. The transaction was the fix. The anticipation of the hunt, the act of purchasing, the brief, intoxicating surge of completion, it was the exact same dopamine-driven cycle that propels the marginalized addict toward the needle or the pipe. The deceit inherent in this compulsion flawlessly mirrored the tragic manipulations witnessed daily in the clinic. There were elaborate lies told to a spouse about the extent of the spending and the origin of the new boxes. There were secretive, shame-filled maneuvers to smuggle the illicit bags into the house, hiding them in the trunk of the car, waiting for the cover of darkness, or an empty home to bring them inside. The most damning parallel occurred in the hospital corridors, where pregnant patients in the vulnerable stages of labor were briefly abandoned so that the doctor could sprint to the music store before it closed. In those agonizing moments, the immediate gratification of the craving was prioritized over the sacred, sworn duty of medical care. The aftermath was always identical to the street addict's come-down. A crushing, suffocating wave of guilt, profound remorse, and the terrified, undeniable realization of a total loss of control. The object of the addiction differs vastly in its social acceptability, but the devastating internal process is indistinguishably the same. This desperate need to fill an agonizing internal void also extended seamlessly into the professional realm. Workaholism is perhaps the most insidious of all behavioral addictions, precisely because it is universally praised and financially rewarded. Society reveres the physician who is perpetually available, the professional who sacrifices his personal life on the altar of his patient's needs. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of noble self-sacrifice lies a profound, cowardly flight from the self. Work became a highly sophisticated, unassailable mechanism to avoid the terrifying intimacy of family life, to escape the quiet, unstructured moments where the internal emptiness and unresolved anxieties threatened to surface. The ringing pager was not merely a call to duty, it was a desperately welcomed distraction, a constant external validation of worth that compensated for a deep-seated, unconscious belief of being fundamentally inadequate. The collateral damage of this socially sanctioned addiction invariably fell upon the very people who deserved the most presence: the family. Just as the marginalized addict inadvertently inflicts trauma upon their offspring through chaos and neglect, the workaholic parent inflicts a different, quieter kind of abandonment. The physical body might occasionally be present at the dinner table, but the emotional attunement is entirely absent, hijacked by the relentless, churning demands of the compulsion. The child instinctively senses this profound absence, internalizing the devastating message that they are less important than the work, less captivating than the parent's obsession. The intergenerational transmission of pain does not always require the presence of poverty, violence, or illegal substances. It simply requires a primary caregiver whose mind is chronically, inescapably elsewhere. Confronting this reality demands a radical, often agonizing dismantling of the ego. It requires stepping into the harsh, unforgiving light of self-examination and admitting absolute powerlessness over the behavior. In applying the rigorous principles of the 12 steps to these socially acceptable compulsions, the first, most difficult truth is acknowledging that life has become fundamentally unmanageable. The arrogance of the intellect must be entirely surrendered. Intelligence, extensive medical training, and high social standing offer absolutely no protection against the primitive, demanding drives of the hungry ghost. The healing process cannot even begin until the fragile facade of control is entirely abandoned, making way for a profound, grounding humility. It is a terrifying but necessary acknowledgement that the internal void can never be filled from the outside, no matter how transcendent the music or how prestigious the career. The journey inward, toward the unhealed hidden wounds that originally birthed the obsession, remains the only authentic path to genuine liberation. Chapter 4. The neuroscience of the high deep within the dark, silent theater of the human skull exists a complex electrochemical universe designed primarily for one purpose: survival. Yet this intricate machinery does not merely seek to keep the heart beating and the lungs breathing, it desperately seeks emotional equilibrium, connection, and a sense of safety. When the external world fails to provide these fundamental necessities, the internal universe attempts to compensate. To understand addiction, one must look beyond the destructive behaviors and examine the underlying biological landscape. It is not a moral failure or a sudden, inexplicable weakness of will. It is a deeply ingrained neurobiological adaptation. Addiction, in its truest essence, is any behavior, whether it involves a substance like heroin or a process like gambling, that provides temporary relief and pleasure, creates a craving, leads to severe negative consequences, and yet cannot be abandoned. The addict is not a broken machine. They are a functioning organism desperately trying to self-medicate a profound internal imbalance. To unravel the mystery of this desperate self-medication, we must confront one of the most pervasive myths about drugs: the idea that the chemical hook itself is the sole cause of addiction. The narrative suggests that certain substances are so inherently addictive that mere exposure will hijack any human brain. History and science, however, tell a vastly different story. During the Vietnam War, a significant percentage of American soldiers used highly potent heroin to cope with the sheer terror and existential dread of combat. The prevailing fear was that tens of thousands of severely addicted veterans would return to the United States, sparking an unprecedented drug crisis. Yet, the overwhelming majority of these soldiers simply stopped using the drug upon returning home. Once removed from the nightmare of the war zone and placed back into the safety of their families and communities, the relentless biological drive to consume heroin vanished. The substance had not permanently rewired them. The terrifying environment had necessitated a chemical shield, which was discarded when the threat disappeared. This profound realization was later mirrored in a revolutionary scientific study known as rat park. In traditional laboratory experiments, a rat isolated in a barren, solitary cage with nothing but a water bottle and a cocaine or heroin dispenser will inevitably consume the drug until it perishes. This isolated setup was long used as absolute proof of the irresistible nature of narcotics. However, researcher Bruce Alexander recognized a fatal flaw in this methodology. The rat was living in a state of sensory deprivation and profound social isolation, a rodent equivalent of solitary confinement. He constructed Rat Park, a sprawling, enriched environment filled with toys, tunnels, decent food, and most importantly, other rats to play and mate with. When the inhabitants of Rat Park were offered the same choice between plain water and drugged water, they almost universally shunned the narcotics. Even rats that had been previously isolated and forcibly addicted chose to endure withdrawals and stop using the drugs once they were introduced into the thriving social community. The experiment proved a revolutionary concept. The environment, the psychological state, and the presence of connection dictate the vulnerability to addiction far more than the chemical composition of the drug. The cage matters infinitely more than the molecule. Within the human brain, the vulnerability to this cage of emotional isolation is governed by specific neurochemical systems, primarily the dopamine circuitry. Dopamine is frequently misunderstood merely as the chemical of pleasure. In reality, it is the fundamental engine of motivation, incentive, and the vital drive to engage with life. It is the neurochemical that makes food appetizing, learning rewarding, and exploration thrilling. In the brain of a severely traumatized or emotionally neglected individual, this dopamine system is critically underfunctioning. They experience a baseline state of profound lethargy, a gray, joyless existence where the normal incentives of life simply do not register. When a stimulant like cocaine is introduced, it forcefully floods the brain with dopamine, artificially creating a towering surge of vitality, confidence, and meaning. For a few fleeting, spectacular minutes, the individual is released from the prison of their own apathy. The pursuit of the drug is not a pursuit of excessive pleasure. It is a frantic life-or-death scramble to achieve a feeling of normalcy and drive that the rest of the world takes for granted. Equally critical is the endorphin system, the brain's internal apparatus for pain relief and emotional regulation. Endorphins are the body's natural opiates, surging to dull physical injury and mitigate extreme stress. However, their role extends far beyond physical trauma. Endorphins are the crucial neurochemicals of emotional attachment, love, and the maternal bond. When an infant is held, comforted, and looked at with profound affection, their brain is bathed in natural endorphins, creating the physiological sensation of being safe and deeply loved. For the individuals wandering the streets of the downtown East Side, this foundational experience of unconditional love was catastrophically absent or shattered by abuse. Their brains never developed the robust endorphin circuitry required to self-soothe or feel secure in the world. When they inject heroin, the drug seamlessly binds to those very same endorphin receptors. The effect is instantaneous and overwhelming. The drug perfectly simulates the neurochemistry of love. It provides the profound unconditional warmth, the absolute safety, and the maternal embrace they never received. It is, quite literally, a warm, soft hug delivered through a needle, momentarily soothing the agonizing ache of a lifetime of emotional starvation. Chapter 5. How the Addicted Brain Develops. To comprehend the sheer biological devastation of addiction, one must first discard the notion of the human brain as a fixed, genetically pre-programmed computer. Instead, picture it as a delicate living organism, one that is fundamentally sculpted, wired, and physically built by its interactions with the environment. Unlike the offspring of most other mammals, who are born highly functional and capable of independent survival shortly after birth, the human infant enters the world in a state of profound prematurity. The vast majority of our neurological development occurs entirely outside the womb. During these crucial early years, the environment is not merely a backdrop for a child's life, it is the very architect of their neural circuitry. And for an infant, the environment is exclusively defined by the emotional state, the physical presence, and the psychological attunement of their primary caregivers. The infant brain requires a specific nurturing climate to grow the complex networks required for healthy emotional regulation. When a caregiver looks into a child's eyes with delight, soothes their cries, and provides a stable, stress-free presence, the child's brain registers absolute safety. In this secure climate, the delicate structures responsible for processing dopamine and endorphins are carefully built, receptor by receptor. The child learns on a profound physiological level how to self-soothe, how to feel joy, and how to process minor distress. However, when the caregiver is chronically stressed, emotionally absent, depressed, or abusive, the infant's environment becomes a psychological war zone. The tiny developing nervous system is flooded with toxic levels of stress hormones, primarily cortisol. This relentless chemical assault fundamentally interrupts the normal, healthy construction of the brain. The infant, completely incapable of altering their environment, must biologically adapt to a world that feels chronically hostile and emotionally barren. This adaptation is where the seeds of the addicted brain are sown. The circuits designed to process the neurochemicals of love, reward, and motivation are severely blunted. The child's brain, desperate to survive the constant influx of stress, prunes away the very receptors needed to feel natural, ordinary joy. Consequently, they grow into individuals who experience a baseline state of numbing emptiness or overwhelming, unmanageable anxiety. Their brains literally never had the chance to develop the internal mechanisms for peace. When such an individual is later exposed to a powerful narcotic or a potent stimulant, the substance does not hijack a healthy, functioning system. Rather, it lands like a miracle upon a profoundly underdeveloped, emotionally starved neural landscape. It forcefully activates the stunted reward centers, providing a massive artificial surge of the very chemicals that were denied to them during their formative years. The intense craving that follows is not a mere desire for pleasure. It is the desperate plea of an impaired nervous system seeking the regulation it cannot generate on its own. Furthermore, this early developmental disruption critically impairs the prefrontal cortex. This intricate area sitting just behind the forehead is the brain's executive command center. It is responsible for foresight, logical planning, emotional regulation, and, most importantly, the ability to exercise impulse control. It is the neurological brake system that allows a mature adult to weigh the long-term consequences of an action against the immediate desire for gratification. In a healthy environment, the prefrontal cortex slowly matures, learning to modulate the primitive impulsive drives of the lower brain. But, in a climate of severe neglect or trauma, this essential braking system remains catastrophically underdeveloped. The resulting cognitive state resembles a child trapped in an adult's body, completely at the mercy of immediate impulses. When the craving for a substance arises, it originates in the primitive, survival-oriented limbic system, demanding immediate satisfaction. In a fully developed brain, the prefrontal cortex would intervene, reminding the individual of the devastating consequences: the loss of a job, the destruction of a family, the risk of overdose or arrest. But in the severely addicted brain, this crucial dialogue never occurs. The prefrontal cortex is simply too weak, too physiologically compromised by early trauma to override the primal screaming demand of the lower brain. The individual acts almost reflexively, driven by a biological imperative that completely bypasses rational thought. This is why attempting to reason with severe addiction or expecting the threat of future punishment to deter the behavior is a futile endeavor. The neurological machinery required to process that logic and inhibit the impulse is fundamentally impaired. Understanding this biological reality dismantles the cruel, pervasive myth that addiction is a matter of weak willpower or poor moral character. Willpower requires an intact, fully functioning prefrontal cortex. To demand that a severely traumatized addict simply choose to stop using is akin to demanding that a person with a shattered leg simply choose to run a marathon. Their brains were structurally shaped by environments devoid of necessary nurturing, leaving them biologically vulnerable to any substance or behavior that promises even a fleeting moment of relief. The addiction is an agonizing symptom of a developmental tragedy, a frantic attempt to survive in a world where the internal compass of emotional regulation was broken long before it ever had the chance to be properly calibrated. Chapter 6. The Myth of Genetics and the Reality of Trauma. Imagine a master blueprint for a grand house. This blueprint contains the ultimate potential of the structure, but it is the environment, the quality of the soil, the severity of the weather, and the care of the builders that dictates whether the house stands firm or ultimately crumbles. Society possesses a deep, enduring fascination with blaming the blueprint. In the realm of severe addiction, the genetic argument offers a comforting, albeit deeply flawed, absolution. If addiction is purely an inherited disease, written inextricably into our DNA from the moment of conception, then the immense societal failure to protect vulnerable children can be conveniently ignored. It allows us to view the addict as a tragic victim of biology, rather than a casualty of a traumatizing world. But this reductionist view completely misrepresents the true, highly interactive biology of human development. It obscures the profound, undeniable reality that the mind is forged not just by what we inherit, but by what we endure. The search for the elusive addiction gene has consumed millions of dollars and decades of relentless scientific research, yet it has yielded no single dictatorial culprit. The simple truth is that genetics certainly play a role in human behavior, but they are not autonomous agents of destiny. A gene does not possess the independent power to force a person to lift a bottle to their lips or inject a narcotic into their veins. Rather, genes provide a vast, complex array of biological potentials. They are like an intricate series of biochemical switches. Whether these switches are turned on or left entirely dormant depends on the specific environment the organism encounters. This is the realm of epigenetics, the science of how external, lived experiences physically alter the expression of our DNA. To inherit a genetic predisposition for high sensitivity or impulsivity does not guarantee an addicted future. It simply means that the individual is far more vulnerable to the damaging structural effects of a harsh, unloving environment. When we look past the comforting illusion of genetic destiny, we are forced to confront the actual prevailing architect of the addicted brain: severe chronic stress and early childhood trauma. When a developing infant or child faces unrelenting adversity, be it profound emotional neglect, physical violence, sexual abuse, or the systemic, grinding chaos of deep poverty, their biological stress response system is forced into a state of permanent overdrive. The brain's delicate internal machinery, specifically the axis responsible for releasing cortisol and adrenaline, becomes fundamentally deregulated. Instead of acting as a temporary alarm system for immediate physical danger, the system becomes locked in the on position. The child's baseline state of physiological existence becomes one of low-grade terror and hyperarousal. They are perpetually braced for an impact that has already happened. This state of chronic, unyielding biological stress is profoundly agonizing. It corrodes the nervous system, impairs the immune system, and fundamentally exhausts the developing psyche. The brain, absolutely desperate for a state of equilibrium and safety, will relentlessly seek out any mechanism capable of shutting down the blaring internal alarms. This is where the biology of trauma intersects catastrophically with the biology of addiction. The illicit substances do not hijack a healthy brain. They act as highly effective artificial suppressants for a chronically hyperactive stress system. Alcohol, opiates, and stimulants provide the robust chemical off switch that the traumatized brain could never develop naturally. To claim that addiction is simply in the genes is to profoundly disrespect the excruciating reality of what these individuals have survived. It erases the harrowing narratives of betrayal, abandonment, and abuse that inevitably echo through the corridors of every detox facility and rehabilitation clinic. The vulnerability to addiction may very well have a subtle genetic component, a slight biological tilt in the foundation. But the disease itself, the desperate, consuming, lethal compulsion, is forged in the furnace of unbearable, unsoothed human suffering. The addiction is never the core problem. It is merely the individual's most effective, tragic attempt to survive a psychological landscape shaped by trauma that the rest of society prefers to ignore. Chapter 7. The Void Within. The Addictive Personality. Beneath the intricate neurological wiring and the tragic histories of trauma lies the deeply psychological landscape of the addiction process. To navigate this terrain is to encounter the defining feature of the addictive personality, an immense, terrifying, internal void. This void is not merely a philosophical concept, it is a visceral, agonizing emptiness that resides at the very core of the individual's being. It is an absence of self-worth, an absence of fundamental peace, and an absence of the innate sense that one is enough. For the addict, the prospect of sitting alone with this emptiness, without distraction or chemical sedation, is perceived as a lethal threat. The silence of one's own mind becomes an unbearable echo chamber of past shame and present inadequacy. Consequently, the primary driving force of the addictive personality is a relentless, desperate flight from the self. The individual adopts a singular, unspoken manifesto. There is a void within, and I will do absolutely anything to avoid feeling it. This frantic avoidance dictates a life lived entirely on the surface, endlessly oriented toward the external world. The internal climate is too hostile, too fraught with unresolved pain to inhabit safely. Therefore, the addict becomes a master of externalization, investing an overwhelming amount of time, energy, and resources into things outside of themselves. The tragedy of this coping mechanism is the profound delusion that an internal wound can be permanently healed by an external application. Whether the chosen salve is a syringe of heroin, a bottle of vodka, a manic shopping spree, or a compulsive pursuit of professional success, the underlying mathematics of the addiction remain identical. The individual attempts to pour external acquisitions into an internal black hole. Yet the physics of the psyche dictate that a spiritual and emotional vacuum can never be filled by material or chemical means. The relief is always temporary, the satiation always fleeting, demanding an ever-increasing dose of the external distraction just to maintain the illusion of wholeness. When we strip away the specific mechanics of the addiction, the needle, the glass, the credit card, the relentless working hours, what remains is a deeply poignant, tragically misdirected yearning. At its absolute essence, every addiction is a frantic search for a poor substitute for love. The original injury, inflicted during the delicate developmental years, was a lack of unconditional emotional attunement. The infant or child was denied the foundational experience of being deeply seen, thoroughly accepted, and consistently comforted. The resulting psychological architecture is built around a desperate hunger for that missing connection. The drug, the behavior, or the obsession becomes a surrogate lover. It offers the illusion of an embrace that will never reject them, a reliable comfort that can be summoned at will, and a temporary shield against the crushing terror of isolation. However, this surrogate is utterly devoid of genuine nourishment. It is a parasitic relationship masquerading as salvation. The substance demands absolute loyalty, systematically isolating the individual from authentic human connections, dismantling their self-respect, and ultimately consuming the very life it promised to save. The addictive personality becomes trapped in a devastating paradox. The very mechanism they use to seek a feeling of love and completeness is precisely what renders them profoundly unlovable to themselves and entirely disconnected from the world. Healing, therefore, cannot simply be the cessation of the behavior. To demand abstinence without addressing the void is to leave the individual standing naked in a blizzard. True recovery requires the arduous, terrifying work of turning inward. It demands that the individual finally stop running, turn to face the agonizing emptiness, and slowly, painstakingly, learn to cultivate the internal compassion and genuine self-love that they have spent a lifetime frantically seeking on the outside. Chapter 8. The Social Roots and a Failed War. A society reveals its truest character not in its towering monuments or its economic triumphs, but in how it treats its most fractured, vulnerable members. For decades, the dominant cultural narrative has framed addiction as an isolated individual failure, a tragic anomaly occurring within an otherwise healthy civilization. This perspective allows society to comfortably distance itself from the addict, erecting a barrier of moral superiority. However, when we pull back the lens to examine the broader social landscape, a chilling reality emerges. Severe addiction is not an aberration of modern society. It is a direct, predictable product of it. It is the toxic runoff of a culture that has systematically dismantled the foundational pillars of human well-being: community, genuine connection, and a sense of shared meaning. The psychological concept of dislocation is paramount to understanding this epidemic. Throughout the vast majority of human history, humans existed within tightly woven tribes and communities. These structures provided an inescapable web of mutual support, shared rituals, and collective emotional regulation. The tribe was the ultimate buffer against trauma. Modernity, for all its technological miracles, has violently severed these ancient bonds. We have engineered a society characterized by profound, widespread isolation. Families are fractured, communities are transient, and the relentless hyper-competitive pursuit of individual wealth has replaced the collective safety net. This mass dislocation creates an agonizing, pervasive sense of emptiness and anxiety. The human nervous system, evolved for connection, finds itself stranded in an emotional desert. When society fails to provide the profound, fulfilling attachments that the psyche demands for survival, vulnerable individuals will inevitably seek devastating chemical substitutes. Rather than recognizing this profound societal failure, the legal and political systems have chosen a path of aggressive, institutionalized cruelty: the war on drugs. This rhetoric suggests a noble battle against an invading chemical menace. Yet, a closer examination of the casualties reveals a deeply unsettling truth. You cannot wage a war against inanimate objects, against powders and plants. A war is always waged against people, and the targets of this specific war are almost exclusively the most traumatized, impoverished, and marginalized individuals within the population. It is a systematic assault on the victims of child abuse, the survivors of intergenerational trauma, and those suffering from severe mental illness. The war on drugs is, in brutal practice, a war on the deeply traumatized. The fundamental premise of the criminal justice system in this arena relies on the illusion of free will. The law assumes that the destitute addict choosing to possess illegal substances is making a rational, calculated decision to break the social contract. This assumption entirely ignores the catastrophic neurobiological realities of trauma and addiction. As we have seen, the severe addict possesses a prefrontal cortex that has been structurally impaired by early adversity, rendering them biologically incapable of exercising normal impulse control. When the primitive brain screams for the only chemical that can soothe an unbearable agony, the concept of a free choice evaporates entirely. To punish an individual for acting upon an overwhelming, biologically ingrained survival drive is to punish them for the physical architecture of a brain they did not choose to have, forged in an abusive environment they did not create. The punitive policies born of this war do not deter addiction. They actively, efficiently multiply its root causes. When a traumatized individual is arrested, stripped of their dignity, isolated in a brutalizing prison environment, and branded with a permanent criminal record, their internal landscape of shame and anxiety is exponentially magnified. The prison system is the ultimate engine of dislocation. It forces individuals further into the margins, entirely severing whatever fragile connections to society they may have retained. Upon release, facing catastrophic unemployment and deep social stigma, the agonizing internal void is deeper than ever. The demand for the chemical anesthetic becomes absolute. The very system designed to cure the societal ill functions instead as a factory that guarantees its perpetuation. To genuinely address the tragedy of addiction, society must face a terrifying reckoning. It must abandon the comforting, aggressive posturing of the war on drugs and look directly into the mirror. It must acknowledge that the rampant drug use on our streets is a glaring symptom of a culture that creates profound emotional starvation. Until we shift our resources from the futile punishment of the afflicted to the healing of the social and psychological fractures that drive the pain, the hungry ghosts will continue to multiply, haunting the margins of a society that refuses to acknowledge its own role in their creation. Chapter 9. Imagining a humane reality. Imagine a courtroom where the defendant is not a criminal, but a critically ill patient bleeding from a catastrophic wound. The judge, entirely blind to the agonizing injury, only sees the bloodstains on the floor as a deliberate violation of public decorum, handing down a punitive sentence instead of a bandage. This grotesque theater perfectly mirrors the tragic absurdity of how modern society handles severe addiction. We have criminalized profound human suffering, responding to trauma with handcuffs and to despair with prison cells. To truly address this devastating epidemic, we must undergo a radical revolution in consciousness. We must abandon the entrenched punitive dogmas of the past and dare to imagine an enlightened social policy, one that finally divorces moral judgment from what is, fundamentally, a complex medical and psychological condition. We must transition from an architecture of punishment to an ecology of care. The absolute cornerstone of this humane reality is the philosophy and practice of harm reduction. To the uninitiated or to those entrenched in the rigid absolutes of the war on drugs, harm reduction is often tragically misunderstood as a surrender, a passive endorsement of self-destructive behavior. In truth, it is the most profoundly pragmatic and compassionate stance a society can take. It begins with the unflinching acceptance of reality. For many deeply traumatized individuals, the immediate cessation of drug use is biologically and psychologically impossible in the present moment. Therefore, if the ultimate goal is healing, the immediate non-negotiable objective must simply be the preservation of life. Harm reduction strips away the unrealistic immediate demand for abstinence and asks a far more urgent question. How can we keep this person alive today? And how can we reduce the catastrophic damage inflicted by their addiction? In practice, this means establishing safe, supervised injection sites, providing clean syringes, and offering unrestricted access to primary medical care without the prerequisite of sobriety. When a chronic heroin user walks into a clean, well-lit medical facility rather than a dark, disease-ridden alleyway, a profound psychological shift occurs. For the first time, perhaps in their entire life, they are not being hunted, judged, or exploited. They are being treated as a human being worthy of safety. This fundamental restoration of dignity is the most potent anti-addiction medicine in existence. When society stops aggressively punishing the addict, the relentless, paralyzing grip of shame begins to loosen. The desperate, exhausting daily hustle to secure the substance and avoid the law is neutralized, creating, often for the first time, a crucial mental space where the individual might actually begin to contemplate a different kind of existence. Taking this logic to its necessary, enlightened conclusion requires the decriminalization of the user and the regulated, medical dispensation of the substances themselves. The vast majority of the violence, the rampant theft, and the infectious diseases associated with severe addiction are not caused by the pharmacological properties of the drugs. They are the direct consequences of the drugs being illegal, contaminated, and controlled by a ruthless black market. If a chronic opiate user is provided with a clean, medically regulated dose of their necessary chemical surrogate, the criminal underworld loses its power instantly. The user is no longer forced to prostitute themselves or steal to avoid the agonizing terror of withdrawal. By removing the crushing stress of the illicit drug trade, we allow the individual's nervous system to finally stabilize, paving the way for authentic therapeutic intervention. However, systemic change is hollow without a fundamental transformation in how we, as individuals and caregivers, interact with the afflicted. This requires the cultivation of a profound, unwavering practice. Compassionate curiosity. Too often, the medical and psychiatric establishments approach the addict with a clipboard of rigid demands, attempting to forcefully fix a broken machine. Compassionate curiosity abandons the arrogance of the expert and adopts the humility of the witness. It means sitting with the individual, looking past the deceit, the manipulation, and the chaotic behavior, and asking internally, what unbearable pain is this person attempting to soothe? When we approach the hungry ghost with genuine, open-hearted inquiry rather than thinly veiled judgment, we change the emotional climate of the interaction. The traumatized brain, perpetually hyper-vigilant and scanning for threats, slowly begins to register a sense of safety. Compassionate curiosity does not mean enabling the destructive behavior. It means relentlessly validating the human being beneath the behavior. It is the steady, quiet assertion that the individual's life has value, regardless of their current capacity to heal. In a society that has historically offered only exile and condemnation, providing a space of unconditional, curious acceptance is the most radical, transformative intervention imaginable. It is the first, essential light breaking through the darkness of the hungry ghost realm. Chapter 10. The Ecology of Healing. A seed buried beneath concrete does not die. It waits for a fracture, a single drop of water, a sliver of sunlight, to begin the agonizing but miraculous process of reaching upward. The human psyche, no matter how deeply buried under years of trauma, chemical dependency, and societal neglect, retains this exact same miraculous blueprint for growth. Recovery is not a sudden, magical erasure of the past, nor is it a fierce battle of willpower against a chemical enemy. It is a slow, deliberate cultivation of a new internal climate. It is the ecology of healing, a profound recognition that while we cannot change the harrowing weather of our past, we possess the absolute capacity to tend to the garden of our present mind. We once believed the adult brain was a static, unchangeable structure, rigidly locked into its developmental deficits. Modern neuroscience has shattered this pessimistic illusion, revealing a brain that is astonishingly plastic, capable of physically rewiring itself until the very end of life. The neural circuits damaged by early trauma and hijacked by addiction are not permanently condemned. When a person intentionally alters their thoughts and behaviors, they literally generate new neural pathways. The brain can learn to manufacture its own soothing neurochemicals. The prefrontal cortex can be strengthened to regain command over impulsive drives. This biological reality offers a staggering hope. The addicted brain is not broken beyond repair. It is simply waiting for the right conditions to finally finish its interrupted development. Cultivating these conditions requires a radical shift in how one interacts with the mind's relentless cravings. The urge to consume, to escape, will inevitably arise. The goal is not to suppress the craving through brute force, but to change one's relationship to it. This involves a disciplined internal practice. First, one must consciously relabel the thought, recognizing it not as a biological necessity but simply as a toxic, mechanical symptom of the addicted brain. Second, reattribute the urge, acknowledging that its source is an old, unhealed wound demanding a false comfort, an echo of a past trauma that has no bearing on present reality. Third, refocus the mind's attention onto a healthy, constructive activity, refusing to let the craving paralyze the present moment. Fourth, revalue the addictive behavior itself, stripping away its romanticized illusion of relief and seeing the devastating, isolating reality it truly brings. To these, a crucial fifth step must be added: recreate. This is the deliberate act of building a life so infused with meaning, connection, and authentic passion that the narrow, suffocating world of the addiction simply loses its appeal. Yet expecting an individual to achieve this monumental internal rewiring while remaining entirely isolated in a toxic environment is a profound cruelty. Healing is deeply ecological. Just as the rats in the isolated cages inevitably succumbed to the narcotics, a human being trapped in poverty, profound loneliness, and relentless stress will find the internal work almost impossible. Sobriety demands an enriched external milieu. It requires a community that provides the spiritual and emotional nourishment the substance once falsely promised. We must build environments rich in opportunity, safe shelter, creative expression, and above all, the consistent, unwavering presence of genuine social connection. The internal climate can only flourish when the external weather provides a measure of safety, warmth, and dignity. For the families, friends, and caregivers standing beside the afflicted, the journey is an agonizing tightrope walk between deep love and absolute helplessness. The most painful yet vital realization for a loved one is surrendering the illusion of control. You cannot love an addict into sobriety, nor can you punish them into it. Attempting to manage their disease will only erode your own sanity and breed deep resentment. The task is to establish firm, self-protective boundaries without ever withdrawing fundamental human affection. It is learning to communicate with compassionate curiosity, letting go of the desperate need to fix, and simply offering a steady, non-judgmental presence. It requires releasing the crushing burden of guilt, recognizing that while past environments may have contributed to the vulnerability, the current responsibility for recovery rests solely within the sovereign soul of the individual. As we stand in the grim, chaotic alleys of the downtown East Side, or look into the mirror at our own carefully concealed compulsions, a profound spiritual truth emerges from the darkness. Beneath the scars, beneath the ravaged veins, beneath the desperate manipulations and the agonizing years of lost time, there remains an inner sanctuary that is entirely untouched. The essence of the human being, the capacity for love, the yearning for connection, the spark of the divine, can never be destroyed by trauma or permanently dissolved by chemicals. It may be heavily obscured, frightened into hiding, and buried beneath decades of survival mechanisms, but it is never eradicated. This is the ultimate triumphant promise of the healing journey. No matter how far the descent into the realm of the hungry ghosts, the core of who we are remains immaculate and waiting. In the grand, enduring ecology of the human spirit, there is truly nothing lost.